Hello everyone, this is Nana and I wanted to pop in and have a quick chat about gauge because I keep getting lots and lots and lots of questions about gauge and I wanted to clear something up. Gauge in a pattern is not there so that you can try to match it. Gauge is not written in a pattern so that you can try and figure out how to make your needles get that gauge. It's not there for that purpose at all. It is there to tell you that the designer who designed it using that needle size, and when they did, they got that gauge, and that's the fabric that they used to create the design. So what you see as you're looking at the pattern as it's draping or not draping or standing or not standing, the gauge that they got gave them the fabric that gives you the pattern that you see in the photos. Do you have to match that gauge or get that gauge? No. Are you going to magically somehow start matching gauge? No. Every designer out there has their gauge, what needles they use for what fabric, with what needles, with what yarn to get a specific gauge, and it varies across the board. There may be some that are similar, but there's not a standard gauge. There's not a this is the gauge you should get, and even the gauge that's written on commercially bought yarn is just a middle of the road gauge, but it does not mean that that's the gauge that you would want for that particular project. Example, if I want to make a basket out of yarn that stands up, I cannot knit it with this yarn this way, because this would not, if I set it down, it's not going to hold its shape. It's not dense enough. If you want to have a shawl that just drapes and flows lighter than air in how it works, you don't want it so dense that it'll stand up on its own. That's not a comfortable shawl. You don't want a stiff fabric. But you could be using the exact same yarn to do the two things. If you want your basket made out of DK weight yarn, but you also want to make a shawl out of DK weight yarn, you're just going to use divergently different gauges. So on the basket, you might be doing a 26 or 28 stitch gauge using DK yarn. But on the shawl, you may be wanting it to be an 18 or a 19, maybe even a 16, because you just really want that drapiness. And then if you're using a DK yarn and you're making a sweater, you may want it to be more of a 20 or a 19 or a 21. So there's no right or wrong. And all DK with yarn are not made equal. They're different. So what do you do when the pattern calls for, say, a US 4, which is a 3.5 millimeter needle or hook if you're crocheting? That's what the gauge says, or it's asking you for that size, and it has a specific number of stitches to 4 inches in crochet or in knitting, and you try to make it, and when you do your gauge swatch, your number of stitches is too many. Well, if your number of stitches is too many, that means that your stitches are smaller, so you're going to get a lot more stitches in the same bus. Think of it as school bus. The gauge is a school bus, and how many students are in there. Alright, so if you put a whole bunch more in there, then when you take away, see, now that's 4 inches. Say let's do it easy. Say it's supposed to be 20 to 4 inches, and all of a sudden you're getting 25. Well, if the cast on is 100, and you have 25 in that 4 inches, you're only going to have 4 sets of 4 inches, because you have 25 times 4 gives you 100. So you'll have 4 times 4, which is 16 inches wide. But if your gauge is supposed to be 20, that means you would have 20 stitches, and 20 goes into the 100 5 times. So you would have 5 times 4 inches, or 20 inches. So being off by those 5 stitches in this particular circumstance, you are going to be 4 inches short in that 100 stitches. So that's why gauge is important. It's not important for you have to match it, you have to get it, you have to use that needle, you have to whatever. It's not. It just means that you may need to do some math in order to decide what pattern or what size you want to make. Now you can just rough estimate it. If you're only off by, say, 1 stitch in the 4 inches, you could, if you have one too many, you know that your stitches are too small, or you have too many in the school bus, so you need to get a few out of that school bus. You know what I mean? So it's going to be your project's going to be too small. You're going to be short in inches. So you would go up a size. If you're off by 1 stitch, meaning you're supposed to have 25 and you have 24, then you have more stitches, or your stitches are going to be wider, so your project's going to come out bigger, so you can go down a size. But if your gauge is dramatically different, then you may want to decide, is the fabric you're getting the fabric you want? Example, this sweater, the pattern called for, I think it was 22. No, I'm in the wrong pattern. No, I think it might be 22. Anyway, so it's 22 stitches to 4 inches with a fingering weight yarn. If I knit the fingering weight yarn up on the needles that I really like, I tend to get 26 stitches, or 24 on the outside edge. So for me to get 22 stitches to 4 inches is really difficult. So what I do is I take my gauge and I divide it by the pattern's gauge to get a ratio. And then I take that ratio and multiply it by the number of stitches that I was supposed to cast on for the size I know I want to wear. And then that gives me a cast on number, and then I want to find the size that matches that cast on number. So let me just say it again. So I take my gauge divided by the pattern gauge multiplied by the number of stitches to cast on for the size I want if I was on gauge. I know it's math, and for some people math is super, super hard. There was probably a gauge calculator somewhere out there, but if not, just message me what your gauge is, what your pattern gauge is, and what your cast on number for the size that you wanted if you were on gauge, and I'll do the math for you. I guess it's not that hard. Anyway, I was just hoping that helps, because I know that there's been a lot of folks who just get really frustrated by not meeting gauge and having this expectation that they're supposed to, that there's something wrong if you're not meeting gauge. Or I've had other people who, I'm always on gauge. That's not possible. It is not possible to always be on gauge. Because I can tell you right now, I can think of 10 different designers just off the top of my head, and they all get a different gauge with a different size needle. So if I needed to use a fingering weight yarn, and I wanted to get a gauge of 24 stitches to 4 inches, I know of a designer that needs to use a US 2. I know one that uses a 2.5, one that uses a 3, one that uses a 4, one that uses a 5, one that uses a 6, and one that uses a 7. They're all designers. They're all out there creating designs for you and me. And so if you're always getting gauge, you're not checking your gauge. You're not even attempting to get gauge. You just assume that you are on gauge. So when you get your final garment and it's a little big or it's a little tight, you just, well, I was on gauge. This is how it's supposed to be. No. Anyway, so gauge is important. It's absolutely, especially if you're doing a garment, it is important, but it is not there for you to get gauge. It is there for you to gauge what you need to do to make the size you want to fit you right. Hope that helped. Bye.